good to be back. No pressure for that introduction. We'll try to come up with some good stories for you. Good to see everybody again. I was clicking around on some of the names and faces, so I remember a lot of you. I'm not sure, Nicole and Ashley and Jen, but what about 7 different programs I've done with My Health Angel? Several, right?
A lot, yeah, since
Yeah.
2020, yeah.
Yeah, and I even I was at the movies the other night, and I was wearing my Health Angel sweater.
Oh,
So someone
really?
came up and
Okay.
asked me what it was, so I was plugging you. But
You should scared to take a selfie and send that to us. We'd love
no,
it.
I should have. Next time I wear it, I'll do that.
Please do. We'd love
You
it.
got it. So I'm going to share screen, and I'm really excited about today's topic. One of my favorite. There we go. Can you all see that? All right. Good.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So today's topic is D-Day, June 6th, 1944. Arguably, you could say the most important day in the 20th century, arguably, if not in human history, because this is the day that began the liberation of Europe, the preservation and continuity of democracy, and the rollback of the Nazi reign, the Third Reich. So, what an important day. Just let me start by saying uh, D-Day, I'm going to talk a little bit about the logistics behind it, some of the unknown stories. I'll talk about the planning. I'll talk about the Nazi defenses. But to start with, one of the things, and I've had the great honor for the 65th, 70th, and 75th anniversaries of D-Day to actually go to the Normandy landing beaches and lead history tours there, meet a lot of the men who stormed the beaches and talk to veterans. So it's always been a topic near and dear to mine. But something that we need to start off by saying, the planning of D-Day. For this to work, Eisenhower and his planners realized everything needed to go right. So first off, because of the more rudimentary, radar and status of air warplanes at the time, they needed a cloudless full moon. So they needed a full moon so they could see to drop paratroopers behind enemy lines. They could see where they were headed. So they needed a cloudless full moon. Because we were bringing a variety of different types of planes including gliders, they also needed a night that was free from wind. So you need a cloudless, non-windy, clear skied, full moon evening. Now, on top of that, they're going to land thousands of men, tanks, supplies on the beaches. So they needed calm seas. They need calm seas. One problem is that the Normandy coast has some of the rougher seas in the entirety of France. And the tides at Normandy, has anybody been to the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia in Canada? Yeah, a couple of you have. You know how the tidal differential there is the biggest in the world. At high tide and low tide, I mean, it's like 2 different seas. So it's the same at Normandy. At high tide, you could have no beach or maybe 50 yards, but at low tide, you could have up to 300 yards of exposed beach. So you have some serious tidal differentials because our men needed to hit the beach, and the Germans were dug in with machine gun nests and artillery all along the hills, ringing the 50-mile wide Normandy beaches. We needed to hit them at high tide. That way, the men are only exposed for between 0 and 50 yards rather than 200 to 300 yards of exposed. Try running with a rucksack and boots while soaking wet in the beach. It's hard to do. So we needed clear sky, no wind, no clouds, calm seas, full moon, and we needed high tide. Now, here's the kicker with D-Day. Everything went wrong. It ended up being windy, cloudy, rainy, and we were forced to land at low tide, and the seas were rough. But here's the ultimate kicker in history. Even though we needed everything to go right to pull this off, everything went wrong, and we still pulled it off for 2 reasons. One, the countless mistakes made by the Nazis. But two, the one thing that Eisenhower and a lot of the planners failed to factor in to the invasion was the courage and heroism of those men that stormed the beaches. So they were the difference maker. So let's talk about all that. So, oops, let me click on. There we go. So the longest day. Has anybody seen the famous movie? Right, The Longest Day. Great cast, right? Everybody. Sean Connery, John Wayne. Remember Red Buttons? Red Buttons played the paratrooper who was blown off course and landed in the steeple in the tower and played dead and actually lived through it. It's based on a real story. The guy's name was John Steele with an E on the end, and that was at Mare St. Ignace. And today, if you go there, in the church still stands, the steeple still stands. They have a dummy with a parachute there today in honor of it. So where does the term the longest day come from? It comes from Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. He was arguably Nazi Germany's best commander. He was known as the Desert Fox because of how difficult he was to beat in North Africa. He would later be in charge of building what we called the Atlantic Wall. That was the Nazi defenses that ran, get this, talk about a formidable wall. The Nazi defensive structures, it wasn't a non-stop wall. It was sections of walls, machine gun nests, mines. The Nazi defenses of the Atlantic Wall that Rommel built ran from Norway to Spain. Wow, from Norway to Spain, built in just over a year. So here's the famous Rommel quote to his aide, Captain Helmut Lang, who wrote this down and had survived the war. The war will be won or lost on the beaches. We'll have only one chance to stop the enemy, and that's while he's in the water. The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. The fate of Germany depends on the outcome. For the Allies, as well as Germany, it will be the longest day. And that's where the famous line comes from. All right, so the planning for D-Day begins at the Tehran Conference. Stalin, FDR, and Churchill. These three, the big three as they were known, held several conferences. In Iran in 1943, the conferences are threatening to fall apart. Why? Stalin. Stalin refuses to cooperate and participate anymore. Stalin says if the Americans and British, the Canadians, the Aussies, the New Zealanders, if they don't open up a Western front soon, in other words, to start the reinvasion of Europe, he's going to stop cooperating. Why? The Soviets lost millions. The Soviet Union ends up burying well over 20 million of its citizens and soldiers. They were assuming horrific losses. Just over a year before this conference, in Operation Barbarossa, that's when the Nazis and Hitler, in just a foolish move, thank God, tried to invade the Soviet Union. And the Germans were victims of their own success, you might say. They rushed so quickly, so deeply into Russia and the Soviet Union that when the cold winter set in, they couldn't get resupplies, warm clothing, extra ammunition, and countless thousands died, froze to death, were starving, or were captured or killed. So Stalin is tired of burying his own people. He said, we need to open up a Western front, otherwise I'm not going to cooperate. You can tell by the photo here, Churchill could not stand Stalin and didn't want to do it. FDR promised Stalin that within 1 year they would open up the Western Front, and indeed they did, and that was the landing at D-Day 1 year later in 1944. It's history's largest invasion. I just put this photo up here just to give you some sense, everybody. Look at the amount of weather and radar balloons, the amount of ships. Those dots down there, those are tanks and trucks and jeeps. The logistics behind this are extraordinary. This is akin to putting a man on the moon in terms of the logistics of this invasion. First off, just how do you keep that many ships from bumping into one another or wrecking? How do you mobilize that many men, that many ships, that much food, that amount of ammunition, of artillery, of gasoline? It's just an extraordinary moment, truly. Here are the vitals. That ship up at the top, the boat up at the top, that's called a Higgins boat. Everybody knows those from footage from the World War II movies. Yep, Armin knows those. And you all saw those in Saving Private Ryan and all the other movies. Those are the boats that we brought the men up on the beaches with. So here's your vitals, everybody. Get this. The D-Day operation involved 6,500 ships. 4,000 landing craft, like the kind you see here, the Higgins boat, 6,500 bombers. In fact, one of the arguments was we might have no resistance whatsoever because we're going to bomb the French coastline back to the Stone Ages. And bomb we did, not only from those bombers, but from the big naval guns docked or anchored just off the coast. We bombed and bombed, and guess what? It did almost no damage. Why? What we didn't realize was the extent of the fortifications that Rommel had constructed. These Nazi artillery bunkers and machine gun bunkers, many of them were 10 feet thick of concrete, 10 feet thick. So we bombed and we blew the top couple feet off, but there were still several feet of concrete. And all the Nazis did was go down into the bunkers until the bombing stopped and then came up and they were at almost 100% strength. The one thing that did happen, because they were in these concrete bunkers, from the concussion blast of the explosions, the reverberation of it, a lot of them had their eardrums were blown out. They couldn't hear, but they were ready to fight. 5,500 fighter planes, everybody. That's an unimaginable number. This formed what we called our aerial screen. So if you have that many thousands of ships at anchor, imagine how vulnerable they would be if a Nazi bomber or torpedo bomber or fighters came in to hit them. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. So at any one point, flying from England to the Normandy coast in France, we had a protective aerial screen of hundreds, if not thousands, of planes, and they would refuel, come out, do the loop, go back, refuel. So we had an aerial screen. If the Luftwaffe, that's the German Air Force, if they had shown up that day, they would have been blown out of the sky in seconds with that amount of firepower. They didn't show up. 2,000 gliders. These gliders were pulled by Halifax bombers across the English Channel, and then the tether was cut free, and the gliders would float in and land behind enemy lines quietly and undetected. That was the plan. The gliders contained our legendary Pathfinders. Has anybody heard of the Pathfinders? Anybody? Okay, so this is our special forces, our paratroopers. Their job was twofold. They would land a few hours before D-Day started, in the middle of the night, behind enemy lines. They had to capture key bridges, key crossing points, and they had to hold them so that once we took the beaches, what good would it do to take the 50-mile stretch of Normandy's beaches and then be boxed up and stuck on the beach and, being vulnerable to enemy attack? Once we got on the beaches, we had to get off the beaches. So you would need those key bridges, roads, and crossroads in order to move inland through France and ultimately into Germany. So the Pathfinders were charged with holding those bridges. Secondly, they were charged with destroying other bridges, telegraph wires, shooting the tires out of German trucks and all that, so that the Nazis could not reinforce the beaches and hit us while we were vulnerable on the open, exposed, sandy beaches. So that was the plan. Now, what's amazing about this, of these 2,000 gliders, we had several thousand paratroopers to conduct this mission. It was so windy, so cloudy, the weather was so bad that about half of all of our paratroopers either wrecked or were blown way off course to the point where they were out of commission. What's extraordinary, we were down to 50% strength in these Pathfinders, yet they still accomplished the mission and held those bridges. Remarkable. We had 1,000 transport aircraft, 5,000 tanks. Can you imagine bringing tanks ashore? The logistics of that are extraordinary. I'll talk about that later. 300 minesweepers. Now, look at this naval force. 7 battleships at the bottom of your screen, 23 cruisers, and 104 destroyers. That is some firepower. That formed our naval screen. So as I said a moment ago, with all those ships at anchor, thousands, they would be vulnerable to, let's say, a Nazi sub or Nazi warships, the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. With those kind of ships surrounding them, there's no way the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, could have fought their way through that. Had the German Navy showed up that day, they would have been sunk in seconds with that kind of firepower. Overall, over 3 million, almost 3.5 million personnel involved. Again, this is the world's largest mission. We need to appreciate just the logistics of that. Now, here's another key. How the heck do you pull off a mission of that size with that logistics? First off, you have to get millions of people, millions of tons of fuel, millions of rounds of ammunition, tanks, artillery, and all that to England. Then from England, you leave to go across the English Channel to France, to Normandy. Now, they first sailed everything to Portsmouth. You're looking at a picture of Portsmouth. So here's the problem. In Portsmouth, there were so many ships that they were literally lined up like, you know, sardines in a row or like, dominoes, just lined up. You had airplanes just piled up on the tarmac. You had warehouses filled with fuel and ammunition. The problem is you have all that piled up at Portsmouth. That is vulnerable to German attack. So here's the kicker. Once you get to Portsmouth, you can't wait very long before you initiate D-Day. The longer you wait, the more vulnerable you are to attack at Portsmouth. And if the Nazis, let's say one day at Portsmouth, out of the clouds come several German bombers, they could have destroyed the entire mission. It took so much effort to bring this many men, this much ammunition, this many artillery pieces, this many ships, this much fuel, this much food. It took so much effort that if they had been destroyed at Portsmouth, it would have been at least another year before we could have put together that amount of firepower to try the mission. So once you get to Portsmouth, you got to go. You got to get out of Portsmouth and get on the beaches. Get on the beaches, okay? Now, the Nazis knew we were coming, everyone. But what didn't they know? They didn't know where or when. They knew we were coming, but they didn't know where or when. The longer you wait in Portsmouth, the more likely that this will leak. What was the saying in World War II? Loose lips sink ships, right, everybody? Yeah. So once we got to Portsmouth, we had to get out of there and hit the beaches. Here's Eisenhower's message that he gave to the troops when they left for D-Day. He had two notes, and he carried in his pockets. I'll tell you about that in a second. His message is: soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Now, your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well trained, well equipped, and battle hardened. He will fight savagely, indeed. Now, that was the one message Eisenhower read. He had a second message in his other pocket. Everybody, this was the message he was going to read if D-Day failed. If D-Day failed, it would be, as I said, at least another year before we could amount that kind of fuel, ammo, and supplies to try this again. During that year, the Holocaust would have continued. The Nazis would have dug in even harder. It would have been more difficult to dislodge. They would have continued to slaughter Europe. So if D-Day didn't work, unimaginable. Eisenhower, like a good leader, was prepared to accept full responsibility if it didn't work. Thank God he never had to take that second note out of his pocket because D-Day worked. The second note read, our landings in the Cherbourg, Havre. Cherbourg is the port on one end of Normandy. Havre is the port on the other end. And there's a 50-mile beach between them. That's the 5 landing beaches we used. Our landings in the Cherbourg Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air and the Navy, did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. So Eisenhower was prepared to fall on the sword. Thank God he never had to take that letter out of his pocket. Here are the brilliant planners. Of course, you recognize Ike on the left. Now, in some ways, Ike probably never should have been the Supreme Allied Commander. He didn't graduate anywhere near the top of his class at West Point. He didn't have very successful commands. He was seen as sort of the dumb football player during his career. But none other than the great General George Marshall advocated for Eisenhower to be the Supreme Allied Commander in charge of all Allied troops. When you had more dashing people like Patton or Montgomery or wise people like Omar Bradley. But it was Eisenhower. Why? General George Marshall, as well as Churchill, And FDR knew that Eisenhower had a good trait. He knew how little he knew. Leaders that think they know everything are the ones that get in trouble. Leaders that don't listen to generals and others are the ones that get in trouble. Eisenhower, they all knew. He knew he didn't know a whole lot, so Ike surrounded himself with the best of the best and listened to them. That sounds a lot like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Harry Truman, and that was Dwight Eisenhower. And here's two of the best. The man in the middle is General Frederick Morgan. He handled all the planning of the land-based aspects of D-Day. Now imagine this, everybody. This is a 50-mile wide beach divided into 5 sectors. The Americans had Omaha and Utah, and you've heard of those. The British and Canadians had Gold, Sword, and Juno. So each of the 5 beaches was given a name, and there was a sector. He planned all the beach landings, all the attacks, and then once everything comes ashore, extraordinary planning. The man on the far right, that's Admiral Bertram Ramsay. He planned all the naval aspects of it, getting that many ships, getting that much supplies, getting all that there. So Eisenhower rightly listened to them, and boy, did they do a great job. Here, I wanted to show you a picture if anybody's not familiar with it. There's a map. You can see Omaha and Utah on the left here. You see that little hook there up on the top left? That's Cherbourg, C-H-E-R. That's the main port. Then you see the British and Canadian beaches on your right. That's Gold, Juno, and Sword. There are a handful of small towns in the area. Can you see on the lower right, I have the dot mark for Caen. Caen is the town where the British and Canadians were going to rendezvous. So once they hit the beaches, they were going to follow that Orne River and the Caen Canal up to Caen, and there they would rendezvous, then begin to march into France toward Paris and later Germany and Berlin. The Americans at Omaha and Utah, they would rendezvous at St. Lo. You see it on the bottom left, everybody? St. Lo. They follow the Vere River up to St. Lo, and that's where they would rendezvous. Now, I have 2 things I want to quickly point. One, on the far left side of the map, do you see the town St. Mary Glace? That's the movie where Red Buttons got stuck in the hanging from the steeple, which, again, as I said, really happened. At Utah Beach, the men were blown so far off course, well over a mile off course. That's how bad the currents were and the wind. They ended up going to St. Mary Glace, and nobody knew where the hell they were. The second thing I want to draw your attention to, you see halfway between Utah and Omaha beaches, I have Pointe du Hoc listed. See that, everybody? Now, excuse me. Pointe du Hoc is one of the most storied and important aspects of the entire D-Day operation. This map doesn't do it justice. I have photos I'll show you later. Pointe du Hoc is a point that jutted way out into the English Channel, like 100 yards way out. It's 100 feet high, so it's a steep point. Earlier aerial surveillance showed that the Germans had several big artillery bunkers, batteries on top of that high point. And they had 88 millimeter guns. These cannons, everybody, these artillery pieces are the size of a telephone pole. They can shoot something the weight of a Volkswagen Bug for miles. So because it juts, again, the map doesn't really do it justice. 2 things. It juts so far out of the English Channel that any American ships coming to hit the Normandy beaches would be blown up by the artillery on top of Pointe du Hoc. Secondly, if you look at it juts out so far, the Americans at Omaha, where I marked Omaha Beach, that was where Private Ryan was supposedly set, Omaha, which was the bloodiest of all the 5 beaches. The Americans are going to get withering fire from the front at Omaha. But Pointe du Hoc sticks so far out that they're also going to get it from their right flank. Can you see that? It sticks so far out, they're going to be shooting crosswise. At Utah Beach, the Americans are going to be getting withering fire from the front, but Pointe du Hoc sticks so far out, the guns could turn and fire to the left and hit them on their left flank. So we had to neutralize Pointe du Hoc. They had to hit it. Now, a quick explanation. D-Day. What does D stand for? Why D-Day? D is a military term that simply means day. It means the day of the attack or invasion. So D-Day is basically day. D-Day, D is the day. That's the day for the invasion. Why do they use that? Because if they have to change the date of the invasion, things could get complicated. So, for example, let's say you need to get all the fuel and tanks ready to go 10 days before D-Day. That would be D minus 10. If you have to have the resupplies come in 3 days later, that's D plus 3, 3 days later. That's a hell of a lot easier than saying if D-Day is June 6th, you got to get stuff in by May 23rd, then you got to have reinforcements by June 9th, now, if you have to change the date of the invasion, you have to change all those other dates and something could go wrong. Whereas if you use D, when you change the date of the invasion from whatever date to June 6th, that just becomes D-Day and everything's still D minus 10 or D plus 3. Got it? H hour. H is a military term which means hour. So, as you guessed, it's a way of saying hour. H hour is the hour that an invasion begins. So, D-Day happened on June 6, 1944. H hour was around sunrise, around 7 o'clock or so that morning. Now, we needed to neutralize Pointe du Hoc. So the Special Forces guys were told to hit it at around H minus 1 or H minus 2. That's 1 or 2 hours before. That way they would neutralize the big guns and then our troops would land. What happened, you see I marked right behind Pointe du Hoc, you see there's a dot there called Grand Camp Macy. So when we hit Pointe du Hoc, they found there were no guns there. Instead, there were telephone poles. General Field Marshal Rommel used it as a decoy. He knew we'd hit it first, so he put telephone poles there as sort of a canary in a coal mine. He knew once we hit it there, it was coming. But while we're landing at all 5 of these beaches, the men on the beaches, even after we beat the Nazis, they're getting shelled from artillery, and they don't know where the hell this is coming from. It was coming from Grand Camp Macy. It's about 1.5 miles away. The Germans built a massive underground fort the size of 4 football fields under the ground, reinforced it with concrete, and the top of it was even to the ground. So what they did is they put dirt on top, they planted grass bushes and trees, so you couldn't find it. There were just small openings for the guns to stick out. And it took us 3 days to find Grand Camp Macy and finally silence the Nazi guns. I'll show you more on that later. All right, here's just another picture to show you. You can see Cherbourg on the left, that's the port. On the far right, Le Havre, that's the other port. And here's the 5 landing beaches. And you can see from the towns, there's a lot of roads that run out to the beaches. Those are the roads we would need to hold. We'd have to have our pathfinders hold those roads while we work our way inland. Has anybody been to Normandy? Anybody been to D-Day? No, a lot of you haven't? Okay, if you ever can, everybody, do yourself a favor and go. It's extraordinary. Here's a photo so you can get a sense of it. The photo I love for Harvey's been. Okay, cool. I like the photo for a couple reasons. Number one, you can see how much the tidal differential is. Do you see all the seaweed up close to the edge of the houses? That's at high tide. Now look at low tide. Those little dots around the middle of the screen, those are people walking. This is how big and open these beaches are. So can you imagine landing at low tide and having to run all the way across those beaches when the hills, you see the hills, they'd be just filled with German machine gun nests. So that's why it was so vital that we landed at high tide. In effect, we ended up landing at low tide. More on that in a moment. Secondly, you can see the size of the hills that we're dealing with, how difficult the terrain was. And thirdly, you see all those big concrete structures in the water? Those are called mulligans. And those things are still there. These are 5-story concrete structures we use for the landings. I'll explain those in detail in just a moment. All right, so D-Day was originally, they were looking at June 4th. Then they had to move it to June 5th. Ultimately, they'd have to move it to June 6th. Why? Do you remember I said earlier the weather had to be perfect? A cloudless, calm sky, no rains, full moon, flat seas, high tide. You needed all that for this thing to work. The concern was when they were planning June 4, the weather was bad. So they pushed it back to the 5th. The problem is, you see the guy on the far left, that's Captain Stagg. He was Eisenhower's chief meteorologist. When they're planning it, Stagg says, I have bad news, everybody. At sunrise, that's when they wanted to attack. It's going to be windy, rainy, cloudy, bad tides, rough water. So they couldn't do it. So they're thinking they have to push it back from June 4th to June 5th. They may have to delay it again. Here's the problem. Do you remember I said at the beginning, the longer we keep our troops in Portsmouth, the more likely the Nazis could hit it. And then it would be another year. Also, the longer they're there, the Nazis didn't know where or when we were coming. We have to keep it a secret. So the pressure's on. So they're ready to push back the invasion. We need a full moon. So get what? Get this. They would have to push it back an entire month. Oh my God, that's unthinkable. As they're debating moving it back an entire month, Stagg runs in and says, I have good news. On June 6th at sunrise, it looks like the winds are going to calm down, the clouds are going to dissipate, the seas should calm down, and that's all advantageous for us. So Eisenhower says, well, there it is, we'll go. Stagg says there's one bad bit of information. It's low tide instead of high tide. Oh my gosh. Remember, for the whole mission to work, you need high tide so the men aren't aren't out in the open for hundreds of yards on the open beaches. So Eisenhower doesn't like the decision. They have a debate. In the center, that's General Montgomery, and on the right is General Smith, the American. Those two say, we've got to go. And Eisenhower says, I don't like the order. I don't see how we can do anything else. He decides to give the order despite it being low tide. Here's the kicker in history. You ready for this, everyone? Low tide ends up being one of the reasons we were able to win at D-Day. Sounds counterintuitive? I'll tell you about it in just a moment. Okay, so we almost postponed D-Day for a second reason. A crossword puzzle. Yes, you heard that right. We almost postponed D-Day because of a crossword puzzle. The man you're looking at, that's Headmaster Leonard Dahl. Doesn't he look like a school headmaster? He was the British headmaster of a private school called the Strand. It was an elite school where all the kids of American and British generals and diplomats went. All the boys went there. Now, back in 1942, in his free time, he was the crossword puzzle master for a newspaper called the Daily Telegraph. And back in 1942, when he was doing his crossword, one of his clues, and I wrote it in the middle of the screen, the clue was a French port, 6 letters. The answer, Dieppe, Dieppe. Well, 2 days later, the Allies tried to do a beach landing at Dieppe, and the Nazis were there and slaughtered us. So the British intelligence and the American intelligence, the old MI5 and our old, the predecessor to the CIA, this ISS, what they said was this guy Dahl must be a spy, and he's using his crossword puzzle to notify the Nazis where we're coming. That's why he said Dieppe. So they arrest him, and they're investigating. They realize it was just a dumb coincidence. So they let him go. Fast forward 2 years, it's almost time for D-Day, and check this out. His crossword puzzle, I put it at the top of the screen. On May 2nd, so this is D minus what, 34. On May 2nd, his crossword puzzle is a U.S. state, 4 letters. Answer, Utah. Yikes. 20 days after that, his crossword puzzle has as a clue a red Indian, 5 letters. Answer, Omaha. Omaha and Utah Beach are 2 landing beaches. So the British intelligence is keeping an eye on this guy. Then here comes the freakiest part. A few days before the invasion, his crossword puzzle makes up a word called Overlord. D-Day was known as Operation Overlord. So they sweep in and they arrest this guy. He's obviously a spy for the Nazis. So they're interrogating him and saying, how could you have known all this? He has no idea. Here's what happened. We went to the ends of the earth to assure secrecy in the mission, but nobody thought about their little boys. So all these generals are sitting around planning D-Day, and their sons are sitting around the dinner table with them, and they're saying, Omaha, Utah, Overlord. The boys hear all this. So what Headmaster Dahl said was, at recess, all the kids at the private school were running around singing Omaha, Utah, Sword, Gold, Juno, Overlord. And he said, "What are those?" And the boys said, "We don't know. Our dads, these generals, keep talking about them." So he put them in his crossword puzzle. So they let him go, and thank God they did not delay the D-Day attack. Operation Bodyguard and Fortitude. These are the Allied deception campaigns. So we wanted the Germans to think we were coming somewhere else on a different day. So look at the map. There's the British Isles, right? And there's France on the right. I put in blue the shortest crossing point on the English Channel. That goes from the White Cliffs of Dover across to Calais, Pas de Calais. So that's where the Nazis assumed we were going to hit them. That's where Hitler thought we were going to hit them. So what did we do? We did all kinds of deception campaigns to make them think we were going to attack there when we had no interest in attacking there. Let me use my cursor. Can you all see my cursor moving around? Here's the Normandy beaches right here. Can you see the little hand cursor? Here's Cherbourg. Here's Le Havre. Here's Utah. Here's Omaha. Here's the 5 landing beaches. So Portsmouth is right here. We were going to come straight down. Here was our attack. But they wanted the Nazis to think we were going to go right here. So that was part of the deception campaign. Here's a map. You can see Portsmouth. You see Le Havre and Cherbourg. Here's Normandy. From there, we're going to take the roads to liberate Paris and then work our way into Germany and Berlin. So that was the plan. So everywhere I put an arrow, that's one of our deception campaigns. What they would do is they would have these midget subs, a small sub manned by 2 people, come up and put very conspicuously, to get caught, to put little landing beacons out in Greece, in southern Italy, as far away as Norway. Then the Nazis would hear that American subs were putting out landing beacons, or British subs, so they would deploy soldiers there, and we were never going to attack. The other thing we did is they found that aluminum foil gave a signature for radar that looked like an airplane or paratroopers. So we would fly over Norway or Spain or someplace, and we would shovel out a ton of aluminum foil strips. The Nazi radar would pick it up, and the Nazis would run entire divisions there thinking that's where we were going to land, and we were never going to do it. So these are our deception campaigns. Of all the deception campaigns, 2 worked the best. Here's one of them, Operation Rupert. You see the dummy on the lower right? So what they did is on the left, the picture on the left, that's bombers. And doesn't it look like thousands of paratroopers coming out of the bombers? They were dummies. What we do is we'd fly above an area and they'd throw all these dummies out with parachutes. And the Nazis would see that and would race there and find a bunch of Ruperts, find a bunch of dummies lying around. So it distracted the Nazis. One of the best deception campaigns was the use of Patton. So we intercepted a Nazi communication that said that the general they were most scared of was Patton, because Patton would never stop coming. He would never retreat, sort of like Robert E. Lee in the South was mostly afraid of Grant, because he would never stop attacking during the Civil War. So this intercept said that the Nazis knew wherever Patton was, that's where the invasion was going to be, because they said the Americans would surely use Patton as the tip of the spear. He would be the first one to attack. So when we found that out, we decided we're not going to use Patton to attack. Instead, we're going to use him as a decoy. So what they did, you see the tank that the men are carrying? You see the plane at the bottom that they're carrying? Just like Macy's Day, they made big balloon floats of tanks and airplanes, and they took Patton to near Dover and had him walk around in public so he could be photographed, because we knew the Nazis were spying. And we would have all these tanks and planes everywhere. The Nazis looked down from their airplanes and thought he had 1,000 tanks. He had balloons. So we created a fictitious ghost army, and the Nazis, Hitler was fooled. He ordered that they move several divisions. Each division is between 10 and 15,000 soldiers. Several divisions to Calais, because he thought that's where we were going to attack. We never did. So D-Day. I'm going to go quickly because I'm a little behind here. So phase 1, these are the paratroopers. Remember I told you about the Pathfinders? The problem is it was so dark at night and so windy. I said 50% of them were blown off course. As you're walking through the fields and forests in the middle of the night, you can't tell friend from foe. So they came up with something called crickets. You know those little jaws that you remove staples from a paper with? It looked like that. You click them and it made a sound like a cricket. So if you're walking through the woods and know someone's there, you do the cricket. If nobody responds, it's the Nazis, so you shoot them. If it's another allied, they would cricket back. And when the first time I went to D-Day, I made the mistake. I bought my son and daughter, they were really little. I bought them these crickets. They walked around chirping the crickets the entire trip. It drove me nuts. Um, Here's the problem. As I said, the planes were blown off course. You see the 5 arrows? That's the way we were going to land, but they got blown all the way around the peninsula of Cherbourg, so they were way off course. Just real quickly on this, we were going to land 16 tanks in our first landing. Why? The men on the beaches are sitting ducks for all the German machine gun nests. If you have a tank, the tank can blow up the machine gun nest. The men can follow the tank safely up the beach. The water was so bad that when we tried to land 16 tanks, get this, 14 of the 16 sunk. Only 2 tanks made it ashore. The quote at the bottom, this is the first communication from the morning of D-Day, radioed back to command. It said, within 10 minutes of the ramps being lowered, that's the ramp from those Higgins boats, the leading company had become inert, leaderless, and almost incapable of action. Every officer and sergeant had been killed or wounded. This was no longer an invasion. Now it was a rescue mission. Thank goodness they didn't call it off. They stayed with it, and we got it done. This is just an image to show you the bewildering. Imagine that the front door goes down and a machine gun fire just kills everybody in the Higgins boat. You see those big things on the beach that look like jacks? My students, by the way, have no idea what the game of jacks is. Nobody's ever played it. This looked like a giant metal jack, only they're 6 foot tall and they weigh a ton. Rommel ordered that these things be put all over the beaches. He called them hedgehogs. There were thousands of them. Now, at the top, they were sharpened. So the plan was when all of our Higgins boats would come to land, the bottom would get torn open by these big ton jacks, and they would sink or be stuck on the hedgehogs themselves. So the beach would be like an Interstate 95 traffic jam. No one could come ashore. So Rommel had placed, as you can see, countless of these hedgehogs on the beach. However, he assumed what? We would attack at high tide. Because of the big tidal differential, at high tide, the top of these jacks are 1/2 foot under the water. So these Higgins boats would run right up on them, get a hole torn open, and there'd be a big traffic jam. At low tide, look, you can see them just sitting there harmlessly on the beaches. In fact, if anything, our men could hide behind them. So by hitting at low tide, it ended up undermining all those defenses Rommel had put in there. This is Pointe du Hoc. Can you see the sheer cliff and our men trying to climb up those cliffs? I went there, and even though I'm 60, I consider myself to be in pretty good shape. I can run and swim, and I can beat our students on campus that are 19. I can beat them in basketball still. But I went there in sneakers and shorts. There was no way in hell I was going to climb up those cliffs. These men did it soaking wet with a rucksack under enemy fire. What was tragic is by the time the men got to the top, all the enemy fire, only 90 out of the 250 special forces were operational. The rest were dead or wounded. Here's some images of Pointe du Hoc. On the top left, you can see how far it juts out. Can you see it's a big, high, 100-foot tall cliff at the very end? The roads, you can see it's a road system the Nazis used. Everywhere where there's like a round concrete structure, that was a Nazi artillery battery that had giant guns the size of cannon poles sticking out of them. You see the bottom left? That's one of those artillery batteries. It's still there, 10 feet thick. Now, do you see all the divots on the top left? It looks like a golf course. Those divots are still there. They're big enough I could run down in those and 50 people could go in them. That's from all the aerial bombardment before D-Day. The landscape is still cratered and scarred today, well over 3 decades later. On the top right, that's Pointe du Hoc. How do you climb up that cliff? On the bottom right, that's a photo of the underground bunkers the Nazis hid in. Utah Beach. So the Americans had Omaha and Utah. Omaha was the bloodiest. At Utah Beach, we were blown over 1.5 miles off course. So when the men came ashore, nothing matched their maps. They were scared to death. They were supposed to land in an area that wasn't heavily fortified. Instead, they went right into a fortified area. 197 casualties as soon as they landed. Um, the good news for the men at Utah Beach was they were led by a great hero named Teddy Roosevelt Jr. You remember the father was famous for charging up San Juan and Kettle Hills in the Spanish-American War of 1898? Charge! He charged up the hill and killed the Spaniards. Well, Teddy Roosevelt Jr. Insisted on being the first man on the beaches. Well, the generals said, "No way, you're a general, you're an old man, you're the son of a president, and you have one leg that works. A knee was shot out in World War I. You're not going to be the first guy on the beaches. This is going to be a meat grinder." Teddy Roosevelt Jr. said, "I demand to be the first man on the beach." None of the generals could get him to stand down, so he was sent to see his cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, the president. Teddy Roosevelt Jr. goes in and he and Franklin get into a huge fight. And he says, "I'm the first man on the beach," as Franklin Roosevelt said, "You're not even a part of the mission," and threw him out of his office. Teddy Roosevelt Jr. walked out and had a great quip. He said to the aides around him, he said, "I'm FDR's fifth cousin about to be removed." However, he disobeyed a direct command and said, "I'm the first guy on the beaches." No one, and I mean no one, could stop him from getting off that beach. No one was about to even try. The good news is he was on the beach. The men are all down on the ground, face down in the sand as it's exploding around them. Chaos on Utah Beach. They're a mile and a half off course. No one knows what to do. Teddy Roosevelt, with his one leg, he had two legs, but one didn't work, and his cane, he drags himself out to the middle of the beach, turns his back to the Nazis, doesn't get hit, and he jabs his cane into the ground and barks out, "Well, we'll start the war from right here." And he ordered the men off their bellies, and they took Utah Beach. A great act of heroism. More on that in a moment. This is the naval screen. I'm going to skip it for time just to show you how many ships we had. These are those mulberries I told you about earlier. You saw them sitting on the beach at the beginning of my presentation. Each one is the size of a 3 to 5 story concrete building. They manufactured them in England, sailed them across the channel, and dropped them in the water. They formed a breakwall, a jetty. Remember I said how rough the seas were? With these giant things in there, the ships could look how calm the water is. The ships could land. Then what they could do is they would put a floating or a pontoon bridge on top of them, and you could unload safely from the ship a tank or a truck or men, put it on the pontoon bridge on top of them, and just drive it right up on the beaches. Talk about engineering know-how and our indefatigable can-do spirit. So that's the mulberries. Here's what they look like, everybody. Those big concrete structures under, those are the images you saw from my earlier slide. Look, they put a pontoon bridge on it. You can drive the tanks from out in the ocean from the ship all the way up onto the beach. That's how we got so much stuff on the beaches. Here's a map to just show you how many mulberries we had and how they keep coming up to the beaches to bring our reinforcements there. This is at Arromanches, not far from where the American cemetery is. I'm going to skip the French resistance just because of the lack of time. The Germans had a bunch of codes. We had a bunch of codes. The Germans were listening in, so we couldn't say D-Day starting. Instead, our code to do it was, "It is hot in the Suez." And then they confirmed it a few minutes later by saying the dice are on the table. The no code that we're going to cancel the mission was the arrow will not pass. So the Germans are listening in, hearing all this stuff, and they had no idea what we meant. Here's the Atlantic Wall. If anybody's been there, structures like this stretched from Norway to Spain. These are massive concrete structures that had artillery pieces in, machine guns. They had underground facilities with water treatment, bunkers, bedding for the soldiers, field hospitals. The Germans built these everywhere. This is what we were dealing with. Just in red on the map, that's at the height of the Nazi reign. All those countries in red were taken over by the Nazis. You can see that, Spain and Portugal, Switzerland and Sweden are neutral. Basically, only the British Isles are fighting back. So it was alarming. I marked in red. You can see at the top, you see Dover and Pas de Calais. Let me move my cursor. Here's where Hitler thought we were going to attack. Look how many divisions. Each one of these red blocks is a division. That's 10 to 15,000 Nazis. Look how many they piled up around there. Fortunately, down here is where we landed. Here's Gold Sword Juno, and here's Omaha, and here's Utah. So we didn't have as much resistance. If a lot of these were down here, we would have had tens of thousands more Nazis when we came down from Portsmouth to Normandy. These are the defenses Rommel built on the lower left. That's those hedgehogs I was telling you about. You can see they're 6 foot tall. You see the soldier beside them, and you see the sharpened top. That would tear open our Higgins boats. On the bottom right, that's something Rommel called a Belgian gate, and that prevented us from getting up the beaches. And the top right, that's Rommel inspecting them. Those are called asparagus poles. Asparagus poles. He would do one of two things. If you have a big pole like this, and the boat comes up, it would run up the asparagus pole and flip over. The other thing you could do is put an explosive at the end and it would hit it and it would blow a hole in the bottom of the boat. So this is what Rommel had everywhere. However, by landing at low tide, all these things were just sitting on the beach, rendered defenseless. There's Rommel, straight out of Central Casting, who would plan all the Nazi defenses. Rommel would ultimately turn against Hitler. Remember the movie Operation Valkyrie, starring Tom Cruise? Anybody? Even though it was Tom Cruise, it was a good movie. It was pretty accurate. Rommel was one of the planners to try to assassinate Hitler. The plot was unsuccessful, of course, and Rommel and a lot of his top folks were given the choice of either being killed or commit suicide. Rommel committed suicide. This is Rommel's headquarters. If you take the River Seine from Paris to Normandy, this sits right along the side of the river. This is my picture. I've been up and down the river a few times. Rommel correctly guessed that the Americans and British were going to land at Normandy, but Hitler wouldn't listen to him. Fortunately, Hitler thought he knew more than all of his generals and wouldn't listen to Rommel. Fortunately, all the other generals were jealous of Rommel and nobody would listen to him. He correctly predicted exactly what was going to happen. This is an image of what Hitler said the Atlantic Wall looks like. Look at the size of that gun. These were propaganda posters put everywhere. One, to try to deter the Allies from trying to invade. Two, to give the German people a false sense of security. If you knew this was protecting you, you'd feel pretty good. So Rommel was assigned the task of building the wall. Hitler had been telling the German people that he built this great wall. Well, he never built a wall. Rommel goes there and there's no wall. All there was propaganda. Rommel called it the propaganda wall, or a figment of Hitler's imagination. He said that Hitler was cuckoo. There was no wall, but yet Hitler kept telling everybody he built walls. But in 1 year, Rommel built the Atlantic Wall. There he is inspecting the wall. Millions of mines, trenches, machine guns, foxholes, trenches, anti-tank systems, artillery, from hedgehogs all the way from Norway to Spain. Look at some of the defenses. Look at the lower right. He actually built what that image was. Hitler had artists draw. So Rommel actually built that for Hitler. Look at that's a man in the end of the gun. How big this is. What defenses they had. Here's a schematic of the gun. I'm going to just skip through it by showing you the scheme under the right. They had artillery. They had water, they had field hospitals, barracks. Here's another one. See how they built it into the hill with twin guns? That way, when we bombed the hill, it didn't even hit the guys underneath. So all this was built in 1 year. How did Rommel manage such a feat? Concentration camp labor. When you have an unlimited supply of unpaid labor and you don't care if they die, you can build that. This is what it looks like today, everybody. This is all along Normandy, these massive guns. Hitler made a lot of mistakes. I'm just going to say one. Rommel wanted 50 to 60 million mines. Hitler almost only gave him 5 to 6 million. Thank God. Rommel wanted, this is a Panzer tank. Rommel wanted tanks all along the roads in Normandy. So if we landed over here, the tanks could race down the road, pull up on the high ground, and then just shell us. But Hitler wouldn't give Rommel tanks. Thank goodness. Rommel made a fateful trip. So it turned out that June 6th, D-Day, it was Rommel's wife's 50th birthday, Lucy Marie. It was her 50th birthday. So Rommel wanted to go home and visit his wife for her birthday. He stopped in France and bought her fancy shoes. You taking notes, gentlemen? Before Rommel left, He checked with his meteorologist and said, "What's the forecast?" The meteorologist said, "What? Rainy, cloudy skies, windy, low tide." Rommel said they'll never attack under those conditions. They need everything I said at the beginning. So Rommel leaves and goes back home to see his wife. That's his car on the lower right and his house on the lower right. He's not even at Normandy when we attack. Now, Hitler goes to bed the night before, heavily medicated. Hitler, as you know, loved to fire people. You're fired, you're fired, everybody's fired. Hitler would fire everybody. Consequently, his staff was afraid to tell him anything. So Hitler gave orders, do not wake me until noon or you're fired. So Rommel gets word that D-Day has begun. He spends the whole morning trying to telegraph Hitler to get him out of bed because D-Day's begun. And Martin Bormann and Hitler's aides were too afraid to wake him up because he'd fire them. So Hitler slept through D-Day. I'm going to skip this because we don't have time. Let me just move to a close. As bad as D-Day was, as bloody as it was, the days after D-Day were even harder and bloodier. Why? Because of this, the hedgerows. So this terrain all across Normandy had been, farmed and looked like that since around the year 300 from the Romans and the Normans. So each one of these fields that are on your screen is the size of a football field. You can see the tanks there. The problem is where the tree lines are, those tree lines have been there since the year 300. So mature, thick trees, boulders, rocks, a hill. So it's impossible almost to get through those fortifications. Behind each one of those natural barriers, behind each one of those hedgerows, were German machine guns and anti-tank. So what would happen is we would try to break through the row of trees, and while we're in the open field, guys would get slaughtered. We'd spend an entire day dying to get one football field's distance. Then we had another tree line, hedgerow. Then we'd spend another day and get one more hedgerow. These go all the way to Paris. So we were burying men and we were going one hedgerow per day. Something had to happen. Here's what was behind each hedgerow. Look at the size of that German machine gun at the bottom. That would just tear anybody apart. The short cannon at the top, the cannon doesn't stick out so you can't see it. That's an anti-tank gun. So when our tanks try to go over the hedgerow, the tank is solid, but what's the vulnerable part of the tank? Just like a turtle, the belly. So if a tank tries to go up over the hedgerow, it shows their belly. One of these guns fires it in the belly, and that's the end of the tank. So this is what the Germans were doing. The only way we could take the hedgerows, some Midwestern farm boy came up with an idea. Let's turn the tanks into bulldozers. And they created a tank dozer. See the big shovel at the bottom? And they could dig through the hedgerow. And then they piled sandbags on the front of it so it would be immune from all the artillery and all the machine gun fire. And this is how we would dig through the hedgerows, and our men would get behind the tank and follow them so they'd be protected from the machine gun fire. The British decided to bomb Caen. Remember my earlier map? I showed you the British and Canadians at Gold Sword and Juno. We're going to go to Caen. The Americans at Omaha and Utah were supposed to go to St. Lo. Well, the British were going to Caen, but the Nazis were there. They were advised to wait, and the Nazis would flee. Montgomery said no, and he ordered it bombed. The Nazis had fled, and we blew up an entire city of civilians. I always thought this photo was powerful because the soldiers carrying a child, probably one of the few people left alive in Caen. Those are the casualties of war, everybody. Now, we originally, Ike wanted to go straight to Berlin, cut the head off the snake, and you kill the snake, go to Berlin. But Charles de Gaulle and the French refused. They said, you first have to go to Paris and liberate the world's greatest city. However, we didn't want to, but we intercepted a Nazi communication. And what it showed us was that Hitler wanted to reduce Paris to rubble. That means the Louvre, all the magnificent artifacts of what is truly the world's greatest city, and reduce it to just rubble. So we intercepted a communique where Hitler is saying, why should we care if Paris is destroyed? The Allies at this very moment are destroying cities all over Germany with their bombs. Then he gave the order on August 17th. Remember, D-Day is June 6th. We could have been halfway to Berlin, but we fought through. It took us a month and a half to fight through those hedgerows. Hitler gives the order on August 17th to destroy the city, so we go to Paris to liberate it. This is a haunting photo of Hitler and the Nazis in Paris. Hitler loved Paris. He was obsessed with it. He was looting all the art from Paris. He wanted to build what he called the Fuhrer Museum in Linz, Linz, Austria. He said it's going to be greater than the Louvre because it would contain everything from the Louvre. These are the two men that really help us to save Paris. Hitler orders, the guy on the right is General von Cholstitz. He's the general in charge, the Nazi in charge of Paris. He's supposed to destroy everything. The man on the left, Taittinger, he is a Nazi collaborator, you know, the Vichy regime. So he's French, but he's a collaborator with the Nazis. So these two are horrible people. However, they love Paris. And when they get the order to destroy Paris, neither man can bring himself to destroy the world's great city, so they saved it. And we intercepted a communique from Taittinger to von Cholstitz, and he says, often it is given to a general to destroy, rarely to preserve. Imagine that one day it may be given you to stand on this balcony up overlooking Paris, again as a tourist, to look once more on these monuments of this great city and be able to say, one day I could have destroyed this, but I preserved it as a gift to humanity. General, is that not worth a conqueror's glory? A hell of a line. And von Cholstitz and Taittinger saved Paris, and then we liberated it. Here's an image I always liked of us liberating it in August, although it took time away from getting to Berlin. I'll close by just showing you the American Cemetery, filled with over 9,000 crosses and 149 stars of David. There were many more men that fought, but a lot of families wanted their sons brought back stateside. So this is what's buried there. There were a lot more Jewish soldiers that fought there, but most Jewish families wanted the boys brought back home. So that's why there's only 149 stars. The Germans suffered 200,000 casualties and 200,000 captured. So Normandy was a disaster for them. Here's a picture of the American Cemetery, everybody. I always like this image. Under the tree on the left, near the water, is the burial of Teddy Roosevelt Jr. Here's the story. I think it was my last slide. Several years ago, I got a chance to lecture at West Point and at the Pentagon, and I had a chance to have, lunch with some of the, the brass. So I was thinking of a good question to ask them, and I said, "What would you say is the high watermark of courage under fire in American military history?" And many of them told me Teddy Roosevelt Jr. at Utah. What happens is he, as I told you, on the beach, he doesn't even flinch as bombs are exploding near him. He orders the men up and to take the hill. There he is, looking as tough as he was with his one leg that worked. A soldier wrote on the beach, he said, "General Roosevelt was standing there waving his cane and giving instructions as only he could do. If we were afraid of the enemy, we were more afraid of him and could not have stopped on the beach even if we wanted to. A mortar shell exploded near him. The general just looked annoyed and brushed off the sand that landed on him, and then he ordered the men up the hill." Teddy Roosevelt Jr. has a heart attack. He refuses medical attention. He orders the men to carry him up the hill. He has a second heart attack. He refuses medical attention. Can you imagine? He has himself laid out on a Jeep, and then he has the officer driving around as he's barking orders to everybody, leading them inland through the hedgerows. He finally has another heart attack and dies, and is buried at the American Cemetery. So that's D-Day again, the biggest logistical undertaking, perhaps second only to landing on the moon in human history. An extraordinary effort in terms of planning. The Nazis made every mistake in the books, thank God. Hitler was, so out of touch with reality. He thought he knew everything when he didn't know anything. Thank goodness. But despite everything going wrong, we still pulled off this great victory because of the courage of the men that were there and fought that day. Thank you.
Wow, that's amazing. So amazing. I was right. I mean, you are a great storyteller. There you are. You lived up to it.
This story tells itself.
Yes. And Linda, actually, out in Oregon, she had just chatted in earlier that she listened to a Western New High School teacher speak about taking his high school students to Normandy, which he did about 13 years ago. And he told us about Teddy Roosevelt Jr. and the wind and how they made it up the hill and showed the picture of his headstone. And she thought it was very interesting.
Good. I'm glad to hear a high school teacher's doing that. I lead history tours every couple years, like I said, for the anniversary, and I take everybody to the cemetery to see Teddy Roosevelt's tombstone. I take them to Utah, Omaha. I take them to Point du Hoc. Some of those pictures were mine. So yeah, it's nothing like being there, right? When you're there, you get an appreciation of how in the hell did these men do this. So that's
Yeah.
the purpose. And the last time I was there, it was wonderful. It even started to drizzle and got overcast, just like it was that day. It's almost like we ordered it up.
Yeah, for sure. Rose had chatted on a couple things. She had asked, have you ever seen the K1, K2, and K3 area that was built for the German U-boats to be serviced?
I did not. No, I've not been there. Did not. No, I've seen a secret German sub base in the Canary Islands. They had one in the Canary Islands, which is an important thoroughfare if you're coming down from like Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, out the Mediterranean, and then headed across the Atlantic. You can stop there. But no, I've not seen that one.
Okay, and she added another question. Did the armor at Point de Hoc have guns that could reach the English coast?
No, no, it couldn't. Um, the Nazis had some of the largest artillery, some of the largest guns in their arsenal, but they could only reach a few miles out into the ocean, not all the way to the English coast. So they couldn't strike the English coast. But the concern was all of our ships that were sailing in or anchoring to unload folks would be vulnerable to those guns if we didn't take them out at Point du Hoc. Now, inevitably, they weren't there, but what the Germans did have that could reach the English coast was the V1 rocket and later the V2 rocket. V stood for vengeance. Hitler called them as Wunderwaffe, as wonder weapons. And these are the first rockets in human history, and they were not accurate, but they were huge and fast, the size of a small plane. They could be launched from around France and just strike indiscriminately in England. They couldn't pinpoint them, but what a weapon of terror as they would rain down. And these rockets were so fast that planes couldn't intercept them. So the only way to destroy the V1 and V2 was to destroy either the site where they were manufactured or the site where they were launched. What the Germans did, however, they would manufacture them in these buildings they called blockhouses. These things were several stories high, several stories wide, massive 10 feet thick of concrete, and they also went underground. So even if we bombed the top of them, there were still feet of concrete, and the Germans would move them through the forest to launch. So we had a hell of a time trying to target and hit these places. In fact, that's where John Kennedy's older brother, Joe Kennedy, you all know that he died a hero in World War II. We were trying to figure out a way of destroying that blockhouse. So the bombs, 500-pound bombs, just blew a few feet of concrete off. So what they did is they filled a big bomber. I can't remember if it was a B-24 or B-17. I can't remember. B-24 maybe. I don't remember. They filled it with explosives, and his job was to fly it across the channel, aim it at the blockhouse, and then parachute out. And this thing, the whole plane would be a flying bomb. But it blew up somehow. We're not sure how, and he was killed in the unsuccessful effort. So yeah, so the Germans couldn't hit the English coast with those guns, but they could with the B1 and B2.
So Patricia Potter asked, what was the average age of Allied soldiers and sailors who participated in D-Day?
Oh my God, these soldiers were from about 17 to about 24. These are young men, the age of college students that were winning the war. And, you know, I can't even imagine the courage of an 18 and a 19-year-old. Imagine a farm boy from Iowa, Indiana, Kansas, had never been anywhere. All of a sudden they're in England. Now they're crossing the English Channel. And you have to get out of the Higgins boat when that front panel comes down and charge across a couple hundred yards of open beach with withering machine gun fire pouring down on you. Maybe the men in front of you were sawed in half. There were multiple accounts of legs, arms, and torsos. You know, the machine guns would shoot a bullet about the size of this pen, and they'd shoot several per second, 30 caliber, 50 caliber. Those things are brutal and tear through human flesh. Even no body armor could stop it, and they didn't wear it anyway. They didn't have body armor for that many men. So what heroism of these young men. And then after taking D-Day, they continue to fight across the hedgerows, which were just a killing field. It took them a month and a half, as I said, over a month and a half. And then all the way from there to Berlin, having to cross the Rhine River, having to fight, at, at a number of just brutal battles. The Battle of the Bulge, for example, just a bloodbath. And yet these men kept at it. If you want a really good account of this, there's a TV series called Band of Brothers, which is probably the most accurate World War II thing ever done. And it follows Easy Company, E Company, and a true story. The commander, Dick Winter, is from my hometown in Pennsylvania, this great hero. It follows them from Normandy all the way to Berlin in multiple episodes. It's called Band of Brothers. And I would say it's the most accurate. In fact, Dick Winter, I had a chance to talk to him. He said that he was a technical advisor on every facet of it. They got everything right from the uniforms to the battle to the names. To the, so it's Band of Brothers is a hell of an account of that heroic moment in World War II. I think it's the best thing that I've seen.
No, and Armand even added in, I believe Yogi Berra piloted the Higgins boat, a Higgins boat.
Yeah, he was a part of it. I don't remember what he did, but he was a part of it. Good memory on it. Yeah.
Marna, I see your hand is up if you want to unmute.
Yeah, in 2019, I went to Paris and I went to Normandy. I was at Omaha Beach and Utah Beach, and I climbed up into where the Germans were. And I imagined that the waters looked like they had slaughtered a whale with the blood being all over. But I can't imagine that the Americans did not know that the Germans were there in such numbers, that they let these boys out of the boats. It just seems unbelievable to me that they would let them out. Did they really not know?
Okay, good. Yeah, so like you, I've walked the beaches. I've gone down in the German bunkers and fortifications myself. And as terrifying as it would be for the Americans to get out of those Higgins boats, knowing that they had to cross those beaches under machine gun fire, it must have been terrifying for the young German soldier to look out of a hole in the concrete and see as far as the eye could see ships coming, and knowing that, oh my God, there's a few of us in here with a machine gun. The Americans knew the Germans were there. However, Normandy was a 50-mile wide flat beach with ports on either side. If we tried to hit Cherbourg and the Germans blew it up or repelled us, we'd have been in trouble. You could get a toehold on some part of the beach. That was the plan. Then later we took Cherbourg. Now, they knew the Germans were there, but they thought if we bombed the hell out of this the night before, we would reduce any German resistance. So we bombed and bombed and bombed. Cratered the ground. As I said, I've walked through the craters. You probably saw the craters. The ground still looks like a golf course. But what we didn't realize was how thick the concrete was, and that many of these German fortifications went way underground. So the Nazis just went underground and waited out the bombing campaign. That's what we didn't realize. How did we not know this? The Germans didn't let anybody in or around the sites. If any local French citizen tried to get near them, they'd be shot on the spot. And who built all these? Concentration camp labor. Of course, they were either died building them or killed after they built them. So there was no one to tell. We thought the bombing campaign would work, and it did not.
Okay. Rose, I see your hand up.
Okay, right now on my PBS channel here, they are doing they're playing about the Nazi, the mega equipment and
Mega weapons that they had.
Yeah. And also about building K1, K2, and K3. And I was surprised to learn that they had such a big area and moving the subs out with a trolley system per se, and into these different slots where they could be repaired, torn apart, put back together, and shipped back out again. And K3 had some of the biggest and the heaviest fortification. They couldn't even get to it, even when they sent the MOB over there.
Yeah, so I haven't been to that site, but I am familiar with it, and I've been to other similar sites, massive structures that you could bring entire subs and ships inside to repair. They also used huge cave systems, as I said, to do this as well. They also repaired some in the fjords of Norway. So extensive facilities. If you're interested in this, I actually helped research and film a few TV series all on this. One is called Secret Nazi Ruins. The other one's called Secret Nazi Bases. And they aired on Discovery. Now they're on the Science Channel. So if you click on their channel, you can still watch them. There's, I don't know, 6 or 8 episodes per series. And what we do is we actually go to places like this and we film it. And then I tell the audience what happened. And you can actually see some of these outlandish, these surreal structures. Like I said, that blockhouse, we actually go into the blockhouse. It's one of the largest buildings I've ever seen in my life. And yet it's like an iceberg. Much of it you can't see because it's underground. So we go inside and take the cameras under the ground as well. So these structures and these were just extraordinary. What boggles my mind, the Nazis were so far ahead, engineering and scientific wise, from the rest of the world. The first to develop jet planes, the first to develop rockets. Their tanks had better armor. The tanks could shoot farther. Their weapons were better. Just everything. They were so far ahead, and they managed to build thousands of these surreal looking futuristic structures all across the continent, pouring not millions, not billions, but trillions of tons of concrete. How the hell do you do this in the middle of a war? Again, if you use concentration camp labor and you don't care if your workers live or die, and if they work 24 hours a day, you can build a lot. The other thing was, this is part of the reason why the Nazis annexed Czechoslovakia, Austria. They did it for a number of reasons, but one was those places are natural resource rich. They could provide a lot of coal, a lot of ores, a lot of minerals, a lot of wood, all the things the Nazis needed to just keep mass producing as they did. But yeah, it's extraordinary. So check it out. They're now on the Science Channel. One's Secret Nazi Ruins. The other one's called Secret Nazi Bases. And there's one that it's showing now in Canada and Europe called Secret Nazi Expeditions. I think it's on the Super Channel, but it comes to the United States, I think, this summer. And it'll give you some good, and we won an International Film Award for one of them too. So it'll give you a good idea of some of the madness, just the shocking scale of what they were doing. Again, this Atlantic Wall from Norway to Spain, not a continuous wall, but millions of mines and tons of concrete and machine gun nests, the hedgehogs stretching the entirety of the European coastline. Just remarkable.
Yeah. Positive Pat, you go ahead.
Hi, how you doing? What do you think about how do you relate this to what's going on today? When we're sending a lot of our good armory to what's that place?
To the Ukraine, yeah.
Ukraine, and that they're trying to sort of push Putin to start World War III and etc.
Well, yeah, there's of course some analogies. Putin is a psychopath and is a global threat, although he is no Hitler. But what they do have in common is Hitler and the Nazis indiscriminately targeted civilians. They targeted schools and hospitals and communities and slaughtered civilians. They didn't operate according to the international standards of how you treat a prisoner of war, of how you rebuild a war zone. They just slaughtered everybody without any respect for humanity. Putin's the same. Putin's been targeting schools and hospitals and civilian areas. He just hit a train station a few days back, killed 50 people trying to escape. So he's purposely targeting that. This is not the first time Putin's done it. He's done the exact same thing twice in the 1990s in Chechnya, when he attacked the Chechen people and slaughtered civilians with artillery, just like he's doing today. He did the same thing in the Republic of Georgia when he attacked that. He did the same thing in Syria. A lot of the chemical and destructive weapons that were targeting civilian populations came from Russia in Syria during, he was supporting al-Assad during that barbaric fighting. The United States, NATO, which is our allies, Canada and Europe and so on, and NATO's been around since 1949. NATO we could defeat the Russian army. Hell, the Ukrainians are holding them back. But the problem is Putin has chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. And he's crazy enough, he just might launch something. So if he didn't have that, that miles long convoy of tanks and artillery that was stretching all the way out of Ukraine coming in to shell it, we could have blown that thing up. We could have, in under 1 minute, all of that would have been molten metal. No question, easily. The artillery and missile sites hitting them, we could launch on those and destroy every single one of them in a matter of minutes. The Russian bombers are launching cruise missiles, or the ships, we could hit all of them. But he would liable to launch a biological, chemical, or nuclear weapon into Ukraine or somewhere in Europe, and then it would be World War III. So unfortunately, we're left to provide humanitarian aid, military aid to the Ukrainian people, and work with our allies in the EU and NATO to do everything we can shy of putting American boots on the ground to fight the Russians. And it's a horrific decision, but the one that's worse than this is if we did something. So Biden, I actually agree with everything he's doing right now, but it would be World War III.
Yeah.
I understand even China wants to get in on it too.
Yeah, Canada, all of NATO, the Germans are aggressive about it. We are providing millions of rounds of ammunition because the Ukrainians are running out of that. We're providing body armor, which they didn't have. We're providing sophisticated anti-aircraft devices. Ukraine has a very small, old air force. Russia has a massive air force, but we've been able to neutralize Russia's air superiority through the sophisticated anti-aircraft systems the Americans are giving the Ukrainians and showing them how to work. That Russian ship that was sunk, it was from American intelligence, probably American missiles that we gave the Ukrainians. The Canadians are doing the same, the Germans, the Poles, the Romanians, and others are taking refugees. The world's trying to send food and oil and natural gas and everything else they need. The problem is Ukraine was a massive producer of wheat and other items, and Russia's a massive oil producer. So with this war, now we're seeing the price of food, everything dependent on oil, it's going through the roof. So the whole world's suffering, but it's a horrific situation. But
Yeah.
we're doing what we can.
For sure.
Okay,
Uh,
thank you.
Gisela, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, I did. I wanted to know, how can we connect with other lectures? I am fascinated by World War II. I have been to Normandy. I have been to Auschwitz, every time, to Schindler's Factory. And do you organize trips? How can we get information for all of these events?
Yeah, I've been to all those too. Yeah, I lead tours. One simple thing is Nicole and gang, I'm happy to come back again, and I'll do another World War II lecture for you at some point. Maybe I'll do Pearl Harbor or some other major event, or the Holocaust or whatever you want. Yeah, you can reach out to me. My email is simple. It's first initial, last name, R. Watson @lynn.edu. I'll type it in the chat room here for everybody. Why isn't it coming up? There it is. I'll type the chat room. R. Watson @lynn.edu, and I'll send it to everybody. 1 second, everyone, and there it is. Yeah, so in fact, I leave June 1st to go to Europe. I'm leading a month-long tour in Europe. We're going to Germany, Austria, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Serbia, Croatia, Bulgaria, Romania, Transylvania. So we're doing 10 countries the month of June. We're visiting Holocaust and Jewish heritage sites. We're visiting World War II sites and battlefields. We're visiting museums and cathedrals and all sorts of, it's a history tour. Each day I've got about 3 tours scheduled. So yeah, I do that usually every June and every December. And sometimes I lead them in Washington, D.C. to go to all the memorials and monuments. Typically Europe in June or the Middle East, and typically I stay where it's warm in December. I do the Caribbean, Central and South America. So I've been doing it for 18 years, every June and every December. So Yeah, holler at me. I'd be delighted. Yeah.
Yes, I'll contact you. I was in Prague and I took a walking tour of the German um, invasion to Prague. I mean, fantastic. So
We're
I'll be in
starting in
touch for
Prague.
sure.
That's our first place. I'm doing the Jewish Quarter tour. I'm
Yes.
doing the medieval quarter tour,
Yes,
taking people to Terezin, which was a very bizarre concentration camp. Then we're doing a palace tour, and then from there we head to the next place. But yeah, we're starting in a couple days in Prague, which is a great city.
Yeah.
yes, yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Amazing. And I see Joel, last question. Joel, go ahead.
Okay, the last question. As we are landing at Normandy, and what happened to Goring and the Luftwaffe?
Good, good question. So thank goodness the Luftwaffe had been largely defeated. By June of 44, they were basically declawed. Goring, who was a World War I ace, he was a great hero from World War I. Goring, like Hitler, had become, a megalomaniac. He was a compulsive liar and was just out of touch with reality. Goring kept assuring Hitler that the German Air Force was second to none. They were not. And he wasn't replenishing pilots. The training program was poor. He wasn't updating the planes. His tactics and strategies were bad. So by 44, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was rendered, declawed. So we had superiority of the air. We had control of the air. Now, even if Goring, who was the Luftwaffe commander, even if Goring had tried to launch everything they had at us, it would not have worked because of that 5,500 fighter plane air screen. I mean, my God, if he sent, let's say, even something impressive like a squadron would typically have about 8 planes. If he sent like 5 squadrons, that's 40 planes. We had several thousand. They would have been blown out of the sky instantly. So the Luftwaffe was not there. Ditto with the Kriegsmarine. Germany, early on in the war, decided not to emphasize the building of aircraft carriers. This is something we did. It's something Japan did. You project force through an aircraft carrier because you can take planes on board, and each carrier sails with a carrier, a fleet. So a carrier won't sail by itself. There'll be subs, minesweepers, guided cruisers. There's destroyers and battleships with a carrier. Germany didn't focus on carriers at all. They only built a handful of battleships, but they focused on subs. So they didn't really build an offensive navy or even a defensive navy. They built a terror navy. And the head of the Kriegsmarine was Admiral Karl Dönitz, who was an old submarine officer. So he only saw subs, and Hitler was so stark raving mad that the Nazis made every mistake in the book with their navy and their air force. Thank goodness. And both of those mistakes allowed us to have complete control of the seas off the 50-mile coast of Normandy and the skies all around it and on our way into Paris and ultimately to Berlin. So yeah, that's the good news.